Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something unusually ancient, unexpectedly crafty, and let's be honest, completely wild. We're talking about the shocking truth about ancient sex toys. And trust me, you're not ready. This isn't just a museum tour with a PG-13 warning. No, you're about to travel back thousands of years to find out just how creative and honestly kind of hilarious our ancestors were when it came to scratching certain itches. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this emotionally. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Also, drop your city and what time it is where you are. I always love knowing who's awake with me at weird hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouching now, barefoot on cool stone, the air thick with dust and ancient echoes. There's no electricity here, only the flickering glow of torchlight reflecting off cave walls in southern Europe. Lascaux, maybe, or some lesser-known but equally haunting cave system dug deep into the earth by humans long gone. You're not on a guided tour. By the way, this is more like a ghost walk with a flashlight and too many questions. You step forward, careful not to touch the delicate red and ochre paintings that snake across the rock. They're older than writing, older than the wheel, older than history. But you're not looking at the famous bison or hand stencils. You're peering into a smaller alcove hidden behind a fallen slab. And there it is, something carved, smooth stone, or maybe ivory. Obvious in shape if you're brave enough to admit it. Roughly 8 in long, and let's just say the design hasn't evolved that much in the past 30,000 years. You tilt your head. No way. But yes, way. Welcome to the world of prehistoric intimacy. We often imagine our Paleolithic ancestors as too busy surviving to, have fun. But the truth is, once you've got fire, tools, and some elk meat in your stomach, your thoughts eventually wander elsewhere. Scholars have unearthed phallic-shaped objects from caves in Germany that date back tens of thousands of years. Objects that could be ceremonial, symbolic, or, well, very personal. One in particular, found in the Hohlfels cave in Germany, is made of siltstone, carefully shaped and worn in all the right places. Some call it a fertility symbol, others call it a baton, and some straight up admit, yeah, it's probably a dildo. Your fingers trace the grooves almost absent-mindedly. This thing was made by hand. It took time, effort, even artistry, and someone at some point in the deep paths decided this was worth keeping, maybe even burying. Maybe it was used in rituals. Maybe it was a prized possession. Or maybe it was the Paleolithic version of a guilty drawer under a pile of mammoth hides. Here's the funny part. Scholars don't agree on what these artifacts were for. One camp insists they were fertility totems or ceremonial tools. Another insists we're being proved by not calling them what they clearly are. The debate rages on, but standing here in the chill silence of a cave, it's hard to ignore how purposeful some of these designs look. Functional even. And let's be honest, the human body hasn't changed that much. Neither have our imaginations. And speaking of imagination, it wasn't all just rock and bone. In the earliest settlements, places like Çatalhöyük in Turkey or the Grecian layers of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found small figurines with exaggerated curves and sensual detail. Yes, the Venus figurines. You've seen them in textbooks, big hips, rounded breasts, faceless heads. They're often framed as fertility idols. But what if they were something more interactive? Some scholars argue they may have been early erotica, 3D art made for pleasure, not worship. Because why not both? The line between sacred and sensual was blurrier back then. These people didn't have taboos in the way we do now. There was no church saying what was sinful, no parental locks on stone tablets. What they had was nature, instincts, and a surprisingly developed toolkit. And that included tools for pleasure. You step back, feeling the damp air settle around you. Somewhere behind you, water drips in a slow, eternal rhythm. These walls have seen everything: births, deaths, paintings, firelight, and maybe, just maybe, the the first blush of something like seduction. But not all sex toys were hard and stone-like. No pun intended. Some may have been made of wood, leather, or even animal skins, materials that don't survive well after millennia. So for every object we do find, imagine how many others have turned to dust. That's the frustrating part. The full catalog of prehistoric pleasure is probably lost forever. But what survived is enough to suggest a people far more playful, far more curious, and frankly, far more inventive than we give them credit for. Oh, and here's your fringe fact for tonight. In some of these same caves, alongside the fertility idols, archaeologists have found musical instruments, flutes made of bone. So it's entirely possible that someone thousands of years ago was setting the mood with music, dim torchlight, and a handmade stone accessory, which kind of makes them cooler than most of us. One final thing before we leave this cave. Some researchers think these early phallic objects weren't just about pleasure or fertility. They might have been used in group rituals, symbolic acts that bonded communities, or honored cycles of nature. Imagine standing in a ring of flickering torchlight drums echoing off the stone, holding a carved object that connected you to your ancestors, your body, and your gods. That's a lot of meaning packed into one artifact. And you're still holding it, by the way, gently like it might break the spell. You place it back where you found it, half hoping no one ever touches it again, and half hoping someone does. You stand, stretch your legs, and follow the dim torch light out of the cave into the night. The stars above you are the same ones they stared at. The cravings, physical, emotional, spiritual, are the same too. Different tools, same needs. And this was just the beginning. You're not entirely sure how you got here. Somewhere between the Nile and the afterlife. But the sand is warm beneath your feet, and the sun feels ancient, heavy, like it's been watching humans play out their dramas for longer than you want to think about. Egypt, land of the pharaohs, pyramids, mummies, and yes, secret drawers that would make your grandmother blush and your high school history teacher break into a nervous sweat. Because tonight, you're not touring the Valley of the Kings. You're cracking open tombs looking for something way more intimate than gold. The first thing you notice is the silence. The second is the way everything here has been preserved with ridiculous dedication. Papyrus scrolls, linen wraps, honey-soaked foods, even entire bodies. So, it's not that much of a leap to imagine that other more personal items might have survived the centuries too. And oh boy, they have. You duck into a tomb, the walls painted with gods, symbols, and glowing hieroglyphs that seem to whisper secrets just out of reach. You're not an archaeologist, but you play one in this fever dream. Your hand grazes a stone shelf. It's covered in dust, but something gleams beneath it. You brush it off and find it for. Well, it's shaped like a banana. If a banana were made of polished wood and carved with little lotus flowers, not something you'd expect next to jars of intestines and protective amulets, but here we are. The Egyptians, it turns out, were very open-minded when it came to pleasure. Sex wasn't something shameful or hidden. It was a gift from the gods. Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, was frequently depicted in full sensual splendor. Men and women alike wore amulets shaped like erotic body parts for protection, fertility, or just good old-fashioned fun. In fact, phallic imagery wasn't just common. It was practically required obelisks. Yeah, kind of a hint. And let's not forget the godmen who walked around with an eternally erect, well, you get the idea. But buried in all this divine symbolism are the artifacts that blur the line between worship and personal use. Scholars have found wooden objects buried with female mummies that, while officially categorized as ritual items, have dimensions and details that suggest a more tactile purpose. Sure, they could have been symbolic fertility tools or votive offerings meant to ensure pleasure in the afterlife, but if you're being honest, they look suspiciously practical for a dead person. You crouch near a burial chamber, the air stale and dry like an old attic. There, tucked in the folds of a linen-wrapped body, is another object. Ivory this time, smooth as riverstone, cool to the touch, ornate, but not ornamental. The idea that this was a comfort item in the afterlife isn't even that far-fetched. Egyptians believed you needed everything in your tomb that you'd need in life: food, clothes, entertainment, even company. So, why not a little pleasure? Not all ancient sex toys were for the elite either. In poorer homes, clay figurines and erotic wall art have been found that depict sexual scenes with a detail that's surprisingly modern. One particularly cheeky fresco shows two figures in a position that would make even a gymnastic coach raise an eyebrow. These weren't private, shameful things. They were part of the visual language of the time. Pleasure was everywhere, from graffiti to temple carvings. And some of those temples, oh, they got explicit. And here's your fringe fact for tonight. The Egyptians used a plant called blue lotus, not just as a decoration, but as a mild hallucinogen and aphrodisiac. Picture this. You're reclining on a low couch, incense curling through the air, sipping fermented date wine with a splash of blue lotus extract. The room is dim, the music soft, and yes, your hand drifts towards something smooth and familiar in the folds of your linen robes. Don't look at me like that. The ancient world had vibes, but not everyone agrees on what these objects were meant for. Some Egyptologists argue that the so-called sex toys were purely symbolic or part of fertility magic, meant to conjure new life, not necessarily to create pleasure. Others insist that the duality is the point. In a world where gods had sex, where life and death were part of the same circle, where the river flooded and crops grew and everything was cyclical, sensuality wasn't dirty, it was divine. You wander out of the tomb, stepping into the soft light of early evening. The sun hits the stone in golden beams, making everything glow like the inside of a jewelry box. In the distance, you see the Nile glinting like a lazy snake. Somewhere nearby, a festival is probably starting. Drums, dancing, and maybe a little more of that blue lotus. As you make your way down a crumbling path lined with statues, you pass a small marketplace where replicas of those ancient items are sold openly. Little wooden or alabaster shapes that tourists giggle at, unsure of whether they're supposed to be souvenirs or historical jokes. But the original makers, they weren't laughing, they were living. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. These weren't people giggling in secret or hiding their desires behind dusty euphemisms. They built a culture where pleasure had its place right alongside prayer and power, where intimacy wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged, and where, yes, someone a few thousand years ago sat down, looked at a block of wood, and thought, I can make this work. You turn back for one last look at the tomb. The air shimmers with heat and time. Somewhere beneath the sand, someone's secret still rests, waiting to be rediscovered. Not shameful, not weird, just human. You blink, and suddenly the desert heat gives way to the dry, lavender-scented air of ancient Greece. The sky is a blinding cobalt blue, and white marble buildings shimmer in the distance like a mirage made permanent. You're standing on a stone-paved street in Athens, and it feels less like a lost civilization and more like an open-air museum that got frozen mid-con conversation. Philosophers argue under olive trees. Someone plays a lyre nearby. And of course, someone else is selling olive oil, and in ceramic jars shaped like body parts you probably didn't expect to see on dinnerware. You walk a little faster. Let's be honest, the ancient Greeks were obsessed with beauty, symmetry, and the human form. And they weren't shy about it. They carved perfect nudes into marble like it was their national sport. And while their art gets praised for its idealism and celebration of form, sometimes it's just downright explicit. Erotic fresco, pottery featuring full-blown orgies, statues with, let's say, enthusiastic detail. You quickly realize that in ancient Athens, sexual expression wasn't hidden in the back room. It was on display, painted in full color on the side of your wine cup. You slip into a modest house off a side street, ducking beneath a linen curtain. The interior is cool, shadowed, private. Inside, a woman is seated cross-legged on the floor, sculpting something out of clay. You watch her fingers shape a small object with the focus of someone making a religious icon. But when you catch the silhouette, It's unmistakable. It's smooth, detailed, and frankly more realistic than anything you'd expect from the 5th century BCE. And then you see a shelf lined with similar forms, some marble, some terracotta, some painted with delicate vine patterns like they might double as decorative centerpieces. Welcome to the Athenian adult toy industry. Yes, really. They even had a word for it, oboes. These weren't just sculptural whims or fertility trinkets. Ancient Greek literature describes them outright as dildos. In comedies, poems, and even everyday banter, the boss makes more than a few cheeky cameos. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, drops references to them like they're standard household items. You begin to realize that the Greeks didn't just tolerate pleasure. They expected it, especially for women. That's right. This wasn't just a boy club of philosophers lounging around in toas. Women, especially upper-class wives and courtesans known as heterae, had access to all kinds of tools for self-exploration. Whether they were married to absent husbands or simply taking control of their own satisfaction, these women had options and artisans to supply them. And because Greece was big on trade, they didn't stop at terracotta. Some oldsboy were imported from Lesbos and other Ion islands, crafted out of soft leather, stuffed with wool or moss, and sometimes soaked in olive oil before use. Which raises the question, did they sell special carrying cases, travel pouches? Did someone have a favorite olive boss they kept under their mattress like a journal? You kind of hope so. You lean against the doorway, watching the potter finish her latest piece. She sets it on a rack beside others, some whimsical, some functional, some shaped with artistic flourish that makes them look like they belong in a modern design store. And you realize this wasn't just about pleasure. This was craftsmanship, pride, maybe even self-care. And here's tonight's historical fact. The olive's boss was so common in Greek daily life that it appeared on household items like oil flasks and even drinking vessels. You could be sipping your wine at a symposium while staring at a comically large rendering of a sex toy on the side of your cup. Cheers. Now for the fringe fact. Some scholars believe Greek women may have used bread, yes bread, as a makeshift sex toy when other materials weren't available. Think soft-shaped loaves baked and then well repurposed. There's a specific term, olix, which literally translates to bread dildo. Whether this was a joke, an actual item, or a commentary on resourcefulness is still debated. But either way, it tells you a lot about how open their culture was about sexuality and how creative or hungry. But not all academics agree on what the olive boss symbolized. Was it purely for private use, or did it also carry religious or theatrical significance? Some researchers argue that these objects may have played roles in rituals, particularly ones connected to fertility goddesses like Aphrodite or Data. Others think they were props in the comedic plays performed during festivals, used more for laughs than lust. Of course, it could be both. Why choose? You wander back out into the street where a procession is passing by, a festival for Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and unfiltered pleasure. Women dance with ivy crowns on their heads, carrying long wooden poles carved into unmistakable shapes. No, you're not imagining things. Those are giant phallic symbols waved proudly through the streets like Mardi Gras floats. Because for the Greeks, eroticism wasn't taboo. It was seasonal, celebratory, sacred. You follow the procession for a while, swept up in the drums and flutes, the pounding of sandals on stone, the laughter echoing off whitewashed walls. You pass a stall where a merchant is selling tiny figurines, some explicit, others more abstract, but all with that same mischievous sparkle. It's hard not to smile. Somewhere between philosophy and orgies, the Greeks built a culture that didn't just accept sexuality, it elevated it. As the sun begins to dip behind the Acropolis, you make your way to a quiet garden, olive trees rustling gently in the warm breeze. You sit down beside a fountain and think about how different this is from the hush-hush modern attitude towards sex toys. Here they were practical, playful, even artistic. They had names, they had jokes, they had a place at the table, literally. You take one last look at the olive oil and Dora nearby, has painted figures dancing, flirting, and doing things that would definitely get you flagged on social media today. But in ancient Greece, just another Tuesday. You've barely dusted off the olive oil and amori before the scene shifts again, like the set of a play being wheeled into a place behind your back. The marble columns turn grander, more imperial. The laughter of the symposium fades into the roar of a crowd, and just like that, you're in ancient Rome, where everything is louder, richer, and unapologetically over the top. If Greece was the candlelit dinner, Rome is the full buffet with dessert, wine, and a few extra limbs carved into the decor. You're strolling now along a cobbled street in Pompeii. Yes, that Pompeii, the one frozen in time by volcanic ash. The place where life stopped so suddenly it left behind not just temples and bread ovens, but also a very, very revealing collection of erotic art and excess spray. You've heard the rumors. You've maybe even seen a few of the more censored museum exhibits. But nothing quite prepares you for the unfiltered honesty of Roman desire. And here's the thing, they didn't filter it. Not in their art, not in their daily lives, and certainly not in the little tools they kept tucked away in their cubicular. Those private back rooms where the real entertainment happened. You duck into one of those preserved homes, sunlight streaming in through an atrium designed to catch rainwater. The walls are painted with delicate frescoes of gods, feasts, and yes, people getting very up close and personal. It's basically an ancient adult film reel, tastefully arranged around the dining room. And right there, carved into the furniture or displayed like a centerpiece, are some surprisingly elaborate contraptions. Rome didn't just borrow the olives boss from Greece. They took it, upgraded it, and then made 12 more versions. Ivory, bronze, silver, even glass. Each one shaped with purpose, detail, and a certain Roman flair for making the ordinary feel theatrical. Some had handles, some had rings for grip. One artifact in the Naples Museum is so ornate you'd think it was a ceremonial wand, until you look a little closer and realize it had a very different kind of magic in mind. Here's your core historical fact for this stop. Sex toys in ancient Rome weren't just for women. There's evidence on walls, in writings, and yes, in preserved objects that men use them too. Sometimes with partners, sometimes solo, sometimes in scenarios we're not even going to try to categorize. Because when you live in a society where Saturnalia, a festival of chaos, lets people dress up, swap roles, and party until they forget their own names, you are going to need a few toys to match the energy. You find one in a small storage nook, hidden beneath a pile of preserved textiles. It's heavier than you expect. Made of bronze, with two ends that suggest some engineering thought went into this. You wonder, was this custom-made, commissioned? Did Roman craftsmen have catalogs? Maybe not in the modern sense, but there's solid evidence that certain brothel offered menus complete with images so patrons could pick their fantasy like ordering lunch. And yes, some of those items included tools of pleasure. In the Lupanar of Pompeii, the city's most famous brothel, there are still wall paintings depicting various acts. And in some of those, the presence of objects that clearly weren't just for show. You get the sense that sex work in ancient Rome wasn't just about people. It was a whole experience curated with ambiance, choice, and props. Now for your fringe fact, some Roman sex toys were apparently enchanted, or at least believed to be. Certain phallic amulets called fascinum were worn around the neck or even hung above baby cribs to ward off evil. That's right, magic penis charms for the Yi protection. And while most of these were symbolic, some blur the line into functional art, like a bronze object discovered in a merchant's home that doubled as both a wind chime and something distinctly less musical. Talk about multitasking. As you wander out into the bustling Roman Forum, you pass vendors selling garlands, meats, cosmetics, and discreetly tucked under the counter's carved bone implement. You glance at one with a handle shaped like Bacchus himself, the god of wine and ecstasy. Coincidence? Not even slightly. It's important to understand the Roman mindset here. Pleasure wasn't sinful, it was expected. A well-balanced life included good food, intelligent conversation, and a satisfying sex life. Sure, they had laws and moralists who grumbled about excess, but even the most pious senators had statues of Venus lounging nude in their gardens. And let's not forget the private libraries. Yes, libraries filled with erotica. Some scrolls were so explicit they remained locked away in secret cabinets of European museums for centuries. But the Romans, they just called it reading material. Of course, not all historians agree on how common sex toys were among the average citizen. Some argue they were luxuries for the elite, objects of wealth and indulgence rather than everyday household items. Others point to the sheer volume of erotic artifacts in places like Pompeii as evidence that these things were as normalized as hair combs or oil lamps. And maybe both are true. Maybe like today, it depended on your budget, your circle, and your willingness to visit that one weird vendor who didn't ask too many questions. You head now toward the outskirts of the city, past the baths, those massive steamy hubs of gossip, hygiene, and low-key flirting. Even here, you notice traces, graffiti scratched into marble walls, depicting not just names and insults, but erotic jokes and little sketches. Some of them are crude, some of them are incredibly specific, and some make you wonder if someone was sketching from real-life experience involving props. The sun is dipping behind the hills now, casting the city in a warm golden haze. Romans walk past you in togas and tunics, laughing, flirting, sipping watered wine. Somewhere behind one of these walls, someone is probably lighting a candle, opening a carved wooden box, and reaching for something they hid under the bed earlier that day. You leave the city behind with one last glance at its marble gods and their very human indulgences. You can still hear the bustle, the clink of goblets, the distant moans of pleasure that might just be echoes of the past, or maybe just some tourists taking the history a little too seriously. The Roman dust hasn't even settled on your sandals before you find yourself in a completely different world. Lush, hushed, and perfumed with the scent of sandalwood and plum blossoms. You're standing at the edge of a sprawling garden filled with koi ponds and whispering bamboo, and just beyond it, a palace made of polished stone and lacquered wood rises into the mist. Welcome to ancient China, and not just the China of philosophy, poetry, or in dynasties, but the one that kept its deepest pleasures behind silk screens and in scrolls too delicate for sunlight. You walk quietly through the garden, trying not to disturb the tranquility. Everything here is precise, every leaf in its place, every ripple in the pond, choreographed like a ballet. But don't let the elegance fool you. This was a culture that knew all about pleasure, and not just in the poetic sense. Tonight, you're stepping into the chambers of emperors and concubines, where sensuality met strategy, and where sex toys were crafted with as much care as a ceremonial sword. The first thing you notice is how beautiful everything is. Jade ornaments, ivory combs, silk robes embroidered with gold thread, and then tucked beneath a lacquered chest, something small, smooth, and cold to the touch. Greenish white, shaped with subtle curves and delicate ridges. You turn it in your hand. It's jade, of course, and it is most definitely not a hairpin. This is the world of the jade dildo, an object both spiritual and sensual, used by the upper classes not just for stimulation, but for health, balance, and even immortality, depending on who you asked. According to some Taoist texts, sexual energy wasn't just a pastime. It was a literal life force called Jing. Preserving it, cultivating it, and directing it properly could enhance longevity and even connect you to the divine. Naturally, specialized tools were involved, and when you're a Chinese emperor with dozens, sometimes hundreds of concubines to keep you busy, you learn to pace yourself. Here's your historical fact for the night. In ancient China, sex was deeply entwined with philosophy. Taoist texts from as early as the Han Dynasty, circa 200 BCE, include entire manuals on sexual positions, techniques, and energy exchange. And they weren't just theoretical. These guides often recommended devices to stimulate or prolong the act, sometimes for the woman, sometimes for the man, sometimes of both at once. Think of them as the world's earliest pleasure-enhancing user manuals. You enter the private quarters of a noble woman, quiet, perfumed, and dimly lit with lanterns that cast soft shadows across carved wooden panels. On her vanity are all the expected items: powder jars, hairpins, silk sashes, and then a drawer that slides open to reveal a collection of objects in varying shapes and materials. Some are jade, some polished stone, others carved bone, or even smooth metal. Dutch is a different size, some etched with floral patterns, others plain and functional. You stare at them the way you might at a modern boutique, curious, slightly flustered, and totally impressed. Now for your fringe fact. There's evidence that some toys were designed not just for penetration, but for vibration. Yes, seriously. One clever design involved inserting a small bead inside a hollow chamber so that movement would cause it to rattle subtly, kind of like ancient baignoire balls. Another involved spring mechanisms or jointed components that moved with the user's body. Primitive, sure, but also kind of brilliant. Pleasure was a science here, with craftsmanship to match. Of course, there's debate over how widely these tools were used outside of the palace walls. Some scholars argue that jade toys were reserved for the elite, symbols of wealth and refinement as much as anything else. Others believe simpler versions existed for commoners, made of wood or ceramic, now long decayed into the soil. Given how few artifacts survive, it's hard to know for sure, but you get the sense that where there were bodies, there were desires, and someone was finding a way to carve that desire into something tangible. You sit for a moment on a low cushion surrounded by silks and whispers of incense. You can almost hear laughter from the inner chambers where concubines and handmaidens lounge between performances and poetry readings. The popular image of the harem, dozens of women waiting in boredom for their emperor, isn't quite accurate. These were centers of culture, education, and yes, personal agency. Women here studied erotic manuals, practiced techniques designed to please but also to control. Pleasure in this context was power. One of the more curious scrolls you find tucked into a bamboo tube details a legend about a courtesan who used a carved stone device to seduce not just an emperor, but to keep his favor through 9 dynastic changes. The scroll is half myth, half instructional diagram, complete with illustrations that definitely aren't about acupuncture. The implication is clear. Mastery of pleasure could be a political tool, and sex toys weren't shameful, they were strategy. You glance back at the collection one last time. These weren't cheap thrills. These were crafted, considered, sometimes even blessed. They were stored with care, handed down in some families or buried in tombs beside their owners, not hidden out of embarrassment, but included for comfort in the afterlife. You wonder if any modern toy will ever get that kind of legacy treatment. Outside, the moon has risen over the koi ponds, casting soft light on the reflective water. A crane steps delicately through the reeds, and somewhere behind a curtain, a zither plays. You stand stretching, suddenly aware of how still everything is here. Like the entire palace is holding its breath, not in shame, but in quiet understanding. The door closes behind you, the jade still cool in your memory. The cool jade air of the palace slips away, replaced by dry heat and the faint earthy scent of clay. You're standing in a settlement that hums with quiet dignity, its wide streets lined with mud brick houses and carefully planned drainage systems. No grand temples here, no glittering scrolls or marble statues. Just orderly blocks, practical living, and a silence that feels more like focus than austerity. You're in the ancient Indus Valley civilization. Now, somewhere between 2500 and 1900 BCE, walking through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, wondering how a society so advanced left behind so little we actually understand. But make no mistake, just because they weren't writing erotic poetry on temple walls doesn't mean these people were without desire. They just expressed it differently, discreetly, symbolically. Or maybe we just haven't translated the signs yet. You wander down a narrow alley where sun-baked walls lean in just slightly. their surfaces decorated with faint impressions from generations of hands. There's a stillness here, broken only by the imagined sounds of pottery wheels and soft footsteps on packed dirt. In one corner of a home, preserved like a memory trapped in clay, you spot a small figurine half buried in dust. You kneel down, brushing it off. It's terracotta, smooth from age with exaggerated hips and full breasts, arms stretched above the head like a dancer mid-twirl. At first glance, it might look like another fertility idol, but the detail, the posture, it's sensual in a way that feels deliberate. The lips are slightly parted, the belly softly curved. Not a goddess, a woman, real, tangible. This isn't your typical goddess on a pedestal situation. This figurine, and others like it, seems to celebrate the human body not just as a vessel for birth, but as a source of pleasure. It's as if the artist knew the exact curve that would draw the eye, the hand. You find more in other homes. Small sculptures tucked into personal corners, buried near sleeping areas, often accompanied by oil lamps or polished stones. Were they art icons or something more private? Here's your historical fact. The Indus Valley civilization was one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of its time. They had sewage systems, standardized weights, and trade networks that stretched across continents. But despite their architectural brilliance, their written language remains undeciphered to this day. So when we find objects that hint at sexuality, like these figurines, we're left to guess their purpose, which frankly makes the mystery even more alluring. And now for your fringe fact. In some ruins, archaeologists have uncovered small cylindrical stones and bone objects with rounded ends, smooth, polished, with no obvious function. Officially, they're categorized as tools or weights. Unofficially, well, some researchers believe they may have been early sex toys, perhaps used by women in private or during rituals we no longer understand. But since no instruction manual has turned up yet, we're left with silent artifacts and a whole lot of eyebrow raises. You move toward what was once a bathing area, a large brick basin sunken into the floor, designed to be filled with water carried from the nearby river. It's quiet here, almost reverent. Water was sacred in this culture, used not just for cleanliness, but for spiritual renewal. You imagine a woman stepping into this pool at twilight, her body glowing in the amber light of clay lamps, perhaps holding a small carved object she kept hidden in a cloth pouch, a moment of privacy, peace, and connection. Not to a god, but to herself. The Indus people didn't leave behind dramatic temples or phallic columns. Their art is more subtle. Beads, seals, jewelry, and yes, these figurines. But if you read between the lines, a different kind of story emerges, one where pleasure wasn't banished, just folded quietly into the rhythms of everyday life. No declarations, no shame, just quiet knowing. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scholars argue that we project too much onto these objects, that calling them sex toys or erotic art is just modern fantasy. Maybe they were dolls, maybe they were offerings, maybe both. The truth is, we may never know. But when you hold one in your hand, feel the weight of it, the warmth from the sun-baked clay, it's hard not to feel the echo of someone's hand. Someone who shaped this, not just for ceremony, but for touch. You duck into another home. This one larger, maybe belonging to a family with trade connections. In a small room off the courtyard, you find another figurine. This one male. And the detail is generous, not just anatomically, but artistically. The posture, the shape, the confidence of it. Whatever else they believed, these people clearly didn't hate their bodies. They might not have celebrated sex in grand temples like later cultures, but in the corners of their homes, it's there in clay, in gesture, in curve. As you walk back out into the street, a breeze picks up, lifting the scent of earth and dried herbs. You imagine the city as it once was, alive with voices, footsteps, or fires crackling in ovens, and maybe quiet laughter behind closed doors. A society so advanced it didn't need monuments to power or pleasure, just space to live and feel and create. One last thing catches your eye, a smooth stone tucked beneath a stairwell. You pick it up, turning it in your hand. It's warm now from the sun, shaped like a river-worn pebble, except too symmetrical, too deliberate. You smile and slide it back into its hiding place. You're not the first person to wonder what it was for, and you won't be the last. You're not walking anymore. You're gliding, bare feet brushing smooth stone, the scent of jasmine curling through the air like a spell. The sounds of the Indus fade into a low humming chant, soft bells ringing in rhythm with your heartbeat. It's darker here, the shadows stretching long and deep between flickering oil lamps. You've arrived in ancient India somewhere around 500 CE, and not the version that lives in textbooks filled with battle dates and empires. No, this is the India of silk-draped temples, candlelit rituals, and a worldview where desire isn't something to hide, it's something to worship. You pass through a carved archway, each stone panel a swirling parade of human forms dancing, embracing, merging into each other like waves. Some of the figures are unmistakably sexual, others are more suggestive, symbolic, almost teasing in how little they reveal, but all of them pulse with life. This isn't decoration, it's theology. You've arrived at a temple devoted to Tantra, where the line between sacred and sensual doesn't just blur, it vanishes. You step inside. The air is thick with incense and quiet reverence. Worshippers move slowly, deliberately, dressed in red, gold, and soft cotton, their faces calm, eyes half closed. You follow them deeper into the sanctuary, where a priestess kneels beside a low altar. Her hands are moving over a small collection of items, bowls of perfumed oil, rings carved from rosewood, and yes, something that looks suspiciously like a sculpted toy. Curved, gleaming, designed not just to fit the body, but to teach it. In the world of ancient Indian Tantra, sex wasn't just an act, it was a portal, an instrument for enlightenment, connection, healing. And that meant it required tools, implements, instruments of intimacy that helped direct energy and intention. These weren't crude or shameful things. They were crafted with care and imbued with meaning. Pleasure wasn't the opposite of discipline. It was the discipline. Here's your historical fact for tonight. While the Kama Sutra gets all the press, it's just one of many classical Indian texts exploring sexuality. Another, the Anangaranga, dives even deeper into techniques, moods, and physical connection. These works don't just mention toys, they describe them, endorse them, and in some cases offer instructions for making them at home. There were phallic wands carved from wood or ivory, sometimes fitted with metal rings for grip and stimulation. Some were said to channel energy directly to the chakras. Others were simply for exploration. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat, watching the priestess select one of the carved tools. It's polished smooth, shaped like a shallow hook with spiral ridges along one edge. She holds it the way someone might hold a prayer bead, delicately, respectfully. To her, this isn't about lust, it's about awakening. Reaching a part of the self hidden beneath layers of thought, tension, ego, and the toy. It's not the goal, it's the guide. And here's your fringe fact. Some temples in South Sab in India house statues that weren't just sexually explicit. They were anatomically instructive. Carvings showing couples might act with toys in hand or being used in ways that mirrored the teachings of tantric texts. These weren't back-alley graffiti or private indulgences. They were public, religious, even pedagogical, like illustrated manuals for achieving spiritual ecstasy through physical union. You walk past an open chamber where a couple kneels together in meditation. Between them lies a small wooden box open to reveal two rounded jade spheres and a delicate wand-like object wrapped in silk. It's unclear who will use what. It doesn't matter. This practice isn't about dominance or conquest. It's about exchange, breath, intention, sensation. Every movement is deliberate. Every tool has a purpose. But not everyone agrees on the interpretation of these artifacts. Some scholars argue that the tools were symbolic only, representing inner work rather than outer action. Others say, no, these were absolutely functional. The carvings, the texts, the preserved objects all point to a culture that embraced sensuality as part of the divine experience. Not dirty, not secret, sacred. You pause near the set of scrolls written in Sanskrit, unfurled beneath a golden statue of Shiva and Shakti, locked in an eternal embrace. The ink describes not just positions and techniques, but the ideal materials for stimulation: cool stone for awakening, heated bronze for grounding, aromatic oils with powdered pearl to calm the inner fire. It's less of a sex manual and more of a sensory grimoire. One passage suggests placing a small ring of sandalwood at the base of the phallus to prolong the wind of joy. Another describes inserting smooth beads along the vaginal canal to sing the music of the womb. That line sticks with you, not because it's graphic, but because it's poetic, like the body itself is an instrument, and toys are just different ways to play it. You wander towards the temple courtyard where dancers move in slow arcs, their bodies painting invisible shapes in the warm dusk air. You recognize some of the gestures from the carvings: the arch of the spine, the curl of the fingers, the tilt of the head. Everything here is layered with meaning. A toy isn't just a tool. It's a ritual object, a reminder, a physical expression of invisible forces. Outside the temple gates, merchants sell bundles of herbs, rose petals, and delicately wrapped objects made of polished wood and stone. Some are obvious, others look like sculpture. Curved loops, spirals, and coils that seem abstract until you hold them. Then your body understands what your brain can't quite articulate. As the sun sets, casting the temple in golden firelight, you realize something. This wasn't about performance. It wasn't about shame or spectacle. It was about being present fully, sensually, spiritually. The toys were never the focus. They were extensions of intention, fingers pointing toward the moon. You take one last look back as the temple bells begin to chime. And for a moment, you understand why they carved pleasure into stone, because it was eternal. The scent changes before the scenery does, cooler, sharper, tinged with cedarwood and something floral beneath the surface. You're no longer surrounded by stone temples or clay brick courtyards. Now there's paper, silk, polished pine floors, and a hush that feels deeper than silence. You've just slipped into ancient Japan, somewhere between the Han and Edo periods, where refinement is everything. But beneath that perfection lies a quiet, elegant kind of mischief. And yes, even here in the land of poetry, tea ceremonies, and rigid etiquette, there were tools of pleasure, exquisitely made, quietly used. You move through a narrow corridor lit by the soft glow of hanging lanterns. A rice paper door slides open, and inside a room appears like a painting to Tammy Matz. A lacquered screen painted with cranes in flight. A low writing desk with brushes still wet with ink. And on the windowsill, arranged as casually as flower petals, a set of objects so discreet you almost miss their purpose. A curved ivory rod, smooth as river glass. A string of silk-tied ceramic beads. A tiny wooden box that opens to reveal two polished spheres nestled in velvet, all made with astonishing craftsmanship. So beautiful, in fact, that it takes you a moment to realize what you're looking at. Because in this world, function and artistry are never separated. Even the most intimate tools are designed to be beautiful. You're in the company of the Suya, or ladies of elegance, courtesans, geisha, noble women who knew that pleasure wasn't shameful. It was a skill, a discipline, a form of power. And toys were not cheap diversions. They were instruments of training, mastery, and sometimes survival. Here's your historical fact. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, Japan had a flourishing culture of sensual art and literature known as shunga. These illustrated books were often explicit, hilarious, and deeply artistic, featuring not just lovers, but the tools they used: dildos, beads, ropes, vibratory devices activated by water flow or subtle motion, some of them mechanical in nature, others poetic in concept. These images weren't hidden. They were collected, traded, and sometimes gifted at weddings. Talk about practical starter kits. One famous shunga print shows a woman reclining on silk cushions, mid-laugh, holding a long, curved toy as if she's about to share an inside joke with the viewer. Her expression says everything. This isn't taboo. It's familiar, confident, human. And now for your fringe fact. Some Edo-era artisans were so skilled in wood carving that they created hollow toys with tiny bells inside. They would chime or vibrate subtly when moved, creating sound and sensation at the same time. Others were designed with delicate internal compartments to hold aromatic oils or incense, so the object would warm and release fragrance during use. Imagine that level of sensory layering. Touch, scent, sound, all harmonized for one singular, deeply personal moment. But let's back up. You're kneeling now at a small vanity table where a silk bundle has been gently unfolded. Inside are 5 or 6 different items, each lovingly wrapped in soft cloth tied with red string. This wasn't just for storage, was ritual, a kind of daily preparation, a meditation on pleasure. You pick up one, a short, wide ceramic plug with a painted cherry blossom design, and you wonder who made it. A male artisan, a female one. Was it commissioned? Passed down? A gift between lovers. Across the room, you spot a scroll half unfurled, not a religious text, but a private diary. The brush strokes are delicate but confident, and the entry reads like poetry. She describes lying alone during a winter evening, warming her fingers by the brazier, the hush of snow outside, and then choosing the white one, the one carved with waves. She doesn't name it. She doesn't have to. The reader knows, and she's not ashamed. Some scholars argue these items were only used by high-class courtesans and not by average women. Others disagree, pointing to accounts of married women, midwives, and even nuns who described using self-stimulation as part of health or purification rituals. In a culture so rich with symbolism, who's to say where ritual ends and desire begins? You move to a small garden outside the room enclosed by the bamboo fencing. The air is thick with the perfume of blooming plum trees. In the corner, a stone water fountain trickles gently, and beneath it, a hollow chamber with a tiny carved figure tucked inside. 2 lovers wrapped around each other in what looks like a delicate dance. And at their feet, a miniature object that's undeniably utilitarian and beautiful, always beautiful. You realize standing there that these weren't hidden items of shame. They were part of the fabric of life, much like a fan or a comb or a brush for calligraphy. They were tools for expression, not just release. And they were maintained, oiled, cleaned, stored in boxes lined with velvet or silk, as lovingly kept as any treasured heirloom. Here's something to chew on. While the West was heading into centuries of sexual repression, Edo Japan embraced sexuality as part of its social rhythm. Pleasure houses were not just brothel. They were centers of fashion, music, storytelling, and innovation. And within those walls, sex toys were not props. They were partners in artistry, crafted by hands that understood the human body as both temple and playground. As twilight deepens, you find yourself in a narrow shop tucked between 2 tea houses. Inside, an elderly man carves quietly at a block of hino wood. He doesn't look up, doesn't pause, just keeps sanding, shaping, smoothing. On a nearby shelf are finished pieces, some clearly ornamental, others more interpretive. He places one into your hands without a word. It's shaped like a wave cresting, delicate as bone. You don't ask what it's for. You just feel the curve of it and understand. Back outside, the lanterns flicker to life, casting golden light over the street. Somewhere nearby, a shamisen begins to play. It sounds sharp and sorrowful. You walk on past shuttered stalls and quiet doorways, and you wonder how many stories are tucked into boxes beneath beds, wrapped in silken secrecy but never shame. Because in this world, pleasure was an art form, and every art form needed its tools. It's colder now, sharply so. The air bites at your cheeks and fills your lungs like ice water. Snow crunches beneath your boots, and in the distance, you hear the hollow thud of an axe splitting firewood. You've arrived in a place where nights are long, homes are warm, and silence is often interrupted by the howl of wolves or the crack of ice shifting beneath frozen rivers. This is Viking country, Scandinavia, around 900 CE. A world of long houses, fur cloaks, iron blades, and surprisingly cozy bedrooms where more than weapons were being skillfully crafted. You step into a long house lit by firelight, the thick smell of smoke and pine sap clinging to the wooden beams. It's built low and sturdy, made to withstand bitter winters and invading armies. But inside, it's intimate. People gather around the hearth. Children play with carved toys. Someone is sewing. And behind a heavy curtain near the back, you feel it. A space that's private, maybe even tender. You duck inside and find a sleeping nook tucked into the wall. Furs are piled thickly, pelts from elk and bear, soft to the touch. There's a low shelf nearby with a few personal items, a carved bone comb, a pouch of dried herbs, a knife in a sheath decorated with knotwork, and curiously a small wooden object wrapped in cloth. You pick it up. It's palm-sized, roughly 8 in long, and unmistakably phallic, smooth, polished, with intricate carvings of ravens, waves, and serpents winding along the shaft. You blink. This isn't a joke or a prank left by bored warriors. This is an object of craft, possibly even devotion. Here's your historical fact. While there's limited direct archaeological evidence of sex toys in Norse societies, there have been finds like the 9th century carved wooden object discovered in Denmark that bore the unmistakable shape and scale of a functional dildo. Of course, when it was found, scholars danced around the obvious, calling it a weaving tool or a ritual object. But eventually, the public consensus won out. It was a sex toy, and a beautiful one at that. Now your fringe fact for the night. Norse sagas and poetry, especially the more irreverent ones, often included vivid references to sexual acts, jokes, and insults that hinted at self-pleasure. Some sources even suggest that warriors went away on long voyages would carve their own tools for keeping company. It makes sense. You're on a long boat for weeks, no land in sight and nothing to do but row, drink, and carve. Why not pass the time with something useful? You crouch near the hearth, watching a woman run her fingers over a half-finished piece of birchwood. She's not hiding what she's making. It's clearly shaped for pleasure, and she smooths the edges with care. Her expression is calm, focused. It's a winter's night project, just like knitting, just like carving runes. Only this one might get tucked beneath the furs and not spoken of directly, except in the knowing glance between lovers. And yes, Vikings had lovers, passionate ones. The sagas speak of desire, jealousy, and bedroom hijinks that read more like soap operas than battle reports. Women had power here, not always politically, but sexually. A woman could initiate divorce. She could own property. And in the right household, she could absolutely own a carved wooden toy without shame. Of course, scholars argue over whether these objects were common or rare luxuries. Some claim the scarcity of artifacts proves they weren't widely used. Others point to the perishability of the materials, wood, leather, bone, and suggest that many such items simply rotted away with time. The harsh climate preserved some things, yes, but even ice can't keep a secret forever. Back inside the long house, the fire has been stoked higher. The children are asleep. The adults drink me from horned cups, laughing in low voices wrapped in warmth. You spot a small box tucked beneath a fur pile, decorated with carved knotwork. Inside are more items, a small vial of scented oil, a leather strap with polished stones, and another toy. This one's slimmer, more delicate, clearly designed for comfort and discretion. You realize something here. This culture, often painted as brutal and war-obsessed, had softness, sensuality, time for connection. Even in the dead of winter, especially in the dead of winter, long nights needed warmth. They needed touch. And if someone had to carve that warmth from a chunk of yew or birch, so be it. One story drifts to mind, half history, half legend, of a Viking shield maiden who never married but was rumored to have kept her own set of carved companions passed down from her mother. Some say they were engraved with runes for fertility, others say protection. Maybe both, because in the Norse world, magic and pleasure weren't far apart. Both required intention, both involved ritual, and both could leave you breathless. You step outside for a moment, breath rising in white curls. The stars above are hard, bright, almost metallic in the deep sky. Somewhere across the frozen hills, wolves are calling. But inside the long house, behind thick fur and stronger spirits, there's laughter and warmth and secrets hidden beneath beds made of pine and pelt. You take one last look at the object still in your hand. It's warm now, shaped by time and touch. You slide it gently back into its cloth, tucking it where it was found. Not out of embarrassment, but out of respect. This wasn't a novelty. It was a necessity. You don't arrive with a flash this time, more like a slow fade into fog. The world around you thickens with mist. The air smells of wet moss and wood smoke, and your boots now sink slightly into damp, grassy earth. You've stepped into the lands of the ancient Celts, not the fantasy version filled with druids and sparkly robes, but the real earthy wild one, where life pulsed in rhythm with nature and magic wasn't something you read about in scrolls. It was in the wind, in the stones, in the blood. And as you're about to find out, also in the bedroom, this isn't a civilization of massive stone cities or marble sculptures. It's a culture of hill forts, sacred groves, and oak-beamed homes huddled against the cold. You're near a small settlement, probably Iron Age Britain or Gaul, maybe 200 BCE. The firelight glows behind thick animal hide door flaps. The moon peers through clouds like it's trying not to interrupt anything. And you're stepping into a roundhouse where something unusually intimate is about to be rediscovered. Inside the space is circular, warm, and alive with scent. Heather smoke, cured meat, something musky and herbal. The walls are hung with tools and chicks' charms, feathers tied with red thread, small bone tokens clinking gently in the draft. A woman sits near the central hearth, grinding something in a stone bowl, not food, resin, mixed with oil. She dips her fingers in and rubs the mixture on the carved object sitting beside her. Your eyes pause on it. It's made of dark, polished wood, clearly shaped, clearly functional. You kneel down, pretending to examine the fire, but your eyes are drawn to the object again. Its surface is etched with spirals and symbols. Ancient ones, probably soda. It's not a casual carving. It's ceremonial and intimate. Here's your historical fact. Celtic tribes, though often described as wild or barbaric by Roman and Greek writers, had rich traditions tied to the body and its natural rhythms. Their spirituality didn't divide sacred from sensual. Both were connected through cycles of nature, fertility rites, and deeply embodied ritual practices. Some artifacts found in bogs and burial mounds suggest the presence of tools that may have had sexual uses. Smooth-shaped stones, carved bone instruments, wooden objects hidden among charms and fertility figurines. Of course, historians usually label these things as amulets, batons, or ritual rods, but when you hold one in your hand and feel how perfectly it rests in the palm or how organically it fits certain curves of the body, well, let's just say not every rod is for pointing north. Now, for your fringe fact, some early Irish myths reference magical rods or staffs that could restore passion, awaken slumbering hearts, or even stir the womb to song. While usually cloaked in metaphor, these descriptions get suspiciously specific. One Welsh poem from the medieval period refers to the silver hook that curls like the moon and draws pleasure from shadow. Poetic, sure, but if you saw one of those tucked in a Celtic grave, you'd be hard-dressed not to raise an eyebrow. You wander toward a second room, more private, dimly lit, filled with the scent of lavender and iron. A basket rests at the foot of a sleeping platform, covered in deer pelts. You lift the edge and find a collection of items wrapped in linen, beads strung on leather cord, a small mirror, and a set of polished wooden objects. Two rounded, one long and gently curved, one crescent-shaped like a half-moon. Moon. They aren't decorated, just shaped with care. You run your fingers along the grain of the wood and notice how warm it feels, how natural in the hand. These weren't mass-produced or randomly whittled by a bored shepherd. These were made with intent, maybe by a lover, maybe by a priestess, maybe by the person who used them. And this wasn't a world that feared the body. Far from it. The Celts painted themselves for battle and ritual. They bathed in sacred springs. Their gods and goddesses were sensual beings, like a goddess of summer, love, and by some accounts, sexual healing. One festival in her honor involved nude bathing and whispered invocations by moonlight. Sound familiar? Some scholars believe Celtic sexual culture was more open and egalitarian than many later societies. There are accounts, albeit filtered through Roman judgment, of Celtic women initiating relationships, owning property, even divorcing their husbands if they weren't satisfied in bed. Not exactly the uptight forest people they're often made out to be. As you sit near the fire again, the woman finishes oiling the carved object and places it gently in a leather pouch, tying it shut with a small feather tucked beneath the knot. She doesn't hide it. She doesn't even look around. It's part of her evening, like tending the fire or brushing her hair. There's no embarrassment here, just ritual. You step outside, the mist has thickened. Across the clearing, a stone circle looms half visible, its surface slick with rain. It was probably a site for ceremonies, harvest rites, maybe even coupling under the stars. Who knows? Some believe the stones align with solstices and lunar cycles. Others think they were fertility sites. One theory suggests that couples would perform symbolic unions there during seasonal festivals, possibly using carved implements blessed by druids or midwives. And that brings us to one final curiosity. Some modern-day archaeologists have started to reconsider wand artifacts found near ancient Celtic burial sites. Not just because of their shape, but because of wear patterns. Smooth tips, rounded handles, sometimes even traces of plant resin or wax. Not something you'd expect from a ceremonial stick unless it was used well ceremonially and personally. The Celts didn't leave behind many written records. The Romans took care of that. But in their streets, symbols, and surviving objects, you can feel the hum of a culture that didn't split the body from the soul. They knew pleasure was power, that it could be magical, medicinal, and sometimes just practical. The tools they left behind weren't stamped or standardized. They were crafted by hand, held by hand, and cherished. As you walk back through the mist, you notice a stone at the edge of the grove, shaped like a crescent and worn smooth by centuries of rain. Someone once sat here under a full moon, maybe alone, maybe not, with something carved and sacred in their hands. Not a relic, not a sin, a spell. The jungle hits you like a living wall, wet, warm, and buzzing with the kind of life that never sleeps. Cicadas scream in the treetops. Parrots call out like drunk theater critics. And beneath your feet, the earth squishes with every step. You're in the heart of Mesoamerica now, in the land of the ancient Maya, somewhere between 600 and 900 CE during their classic period. And yes, you're here for the temples, the glyphs, the precision calendars, but also for something a little more personal. Because hidden in the shadows of pyramids and bull courts, behind layers of ceremony and astronomy, there's another story pulsing beneath the surface. One that's very much of the body. You're standing at the edge of a stone platform, the remains of what was once a palace complex. Thick vines wrap around crumbled pillars, lizards sunbathe on mossy steps. And inside one of the half-preserved rooms behind a wall of faded murals is something you didn't expect. A shallow niche carved into the stone like a personal shelf. In it, a clay pot sealed with hardened resin. You crack it open gently and find wrapped in woven palm leaves a small ceramic object, oval smooth with the faintest impression of ridges around the edge. You pause unsure, but then you hold it in your hand and your brain catches up with your instincts. This wasn't used for grinding corn. Here's your historical fact. While the Mer are best known for their towering step pyramids and eerie precision in astronomy, their art and artifacts also reveal a world rich in central symbolism. Figurines, painted vessels, and even codices depict acts of intimacy, not just in the reproductive sense, but in stylized performative ways that suggest pleasure as both cultural and spiritual. Some of these depictions include tools, small handheld items often shaped like gourds, eggs, or phalluses, incorporated into rituals, dances, or private scenes. And here's your fringe fact for tonight. One Mayan creation myth describes gods forming humans from maize dough, pressing, shaping, molding. But there's an odd tangent in one variant where the gods experiment with shapes, testing which ones bring joy to the clay. Interpret that however you want, but some scholars think it's a metaphor for early sex toys, tools used to stimulate and awaken the body before it's filled with breath. Imagine the gods carving humanity and giving us not just minds, but means. You slip deeper into the palace ruins, past low walls etched with glyphs, and into a chamber where sunlight filters through cracks in the stone ceiling. On one wall, a mural shows two figures reclining beneath a tree, one pouring water from a gourd, the other holding an object that looks suspiciously suggestive. It's not just the shape, it's the context. There's no combat, no ritual sacrifice, no maize harvest here, just pleasure, shared, intentional, serene. And that's where the Mare differed from many of their contemporaries. Their spirituality wasn't all about blood and fire. Sure, they had plenty of that, but they also believed in balance between death and life, pain and ecstasy, body and spirit. And that meant the body was a temple worth exploring, not just enduring. Some glyphs even use euphemisms like flower opening or sun-touching stone to refer to acts of intimacy, often paired with depictions of objects now long vanished. Of course, mainstream archaeologists are still hesitant to label these objects as sex toys. Official reports describe ritual instruments, cultural figurines, or votive artifacts. But you're standing in a room where a series of carved bone tubes lie tucked beneath a bed platform, all smoothed at one end, some still bearing faint traces of resin or red ochre. These weren't used for music, at least not the kind you play out loud. You pick one up and notice the carvings, small symbols etched along the shaft. Some are familiar glyphs, maze, rain, moon. Others are abstract, swirls, eyes, spirals. Was this someone's personal talisman, a magical object meant to bring fertility or love? Or was it both, a sex toy and a spell? Because in this world, those two things weren't separate. You step outside the jungle buzzing louder now. You follow a moss-covered path that winds down into a smaller, more private structure, a steam bath house. The Temescal use it used for healing, purification, and in some communities, sensual rejuvenation. Archaeological digs at certain Maya sites have revealed small ceramic objects hidden in the drain channels of these baths, curved, sealed, and unmistakably handheld. Not accidental, not waste. The idea that sex and ritual were intertwined isn't new here. The Pulvu, the sacred book of the Maya, is full of twins doubling transformation and fertility magic. While sex isn't described explicitly, there's a rhythm of creation and penetration in every myth. The gods plant seeds, merge with the earth, into caves that birth rivers. It's metaphoric, sure, but the metaphors are stacked high like a sculpture of subtle smirks. Here's something wild to consider. Some modern scholars believe that elite women in Maya courts may have had personal pleasure items carved from polished jade, bone, or volcanic stone branchstone. These wouldn't have been tossed aside. They'd be passed down, wrapped in cloth, even buried with the owner. Only a few have surfaced, and none officially cataloged as sexual devices, but the shapes, the wear patterns, and the context hint at far more than we're told. As the day wanes, you sit at the edge of a stepped pyramid, the stones still warm from the sun. Below you, the jungle breathes, steams, sighs. Somewhere out there, a howler monkey screams at the twilight. But here, it's calm. You run your fingers along the ceramic object still in your hand, thinking about the woman who once owned it. Was she a priestess, a noble's wife, a healer, or just someone who understood her own body and saw no reason to apologize for it? You tuck it back into the woven leaves, nestling it in the niche where you found it, because it doesn't belong in a museum behind glass. It belongs here in the hush between vines and stone, in the space where pleasure wasn't a sins, but a song, a private note in the long, rich harmony of life. The air thins as you climb. Each step feels heavier, the altitude wrapping around your lungs like a gentle vice. The Andes rise around you like stone gods, jagged and snow-dusted, their silence deeper than any you've known. You're in the highlands of ancient Peru now, the realm of the Inca, masters of mountains, engineers of impossible cities, and as you are about to discover, surprisingly enthusiastic participants in the long-standing global tradition of sensual creativity. You crest a ridge, and there it is, Machu Picchu, the old peak, or maybe another lesser-known city, now half swallowed by the jungle. Terraced steps climb the hills like frozen waves, and stone buildings sit perfectly aligned with the sun, the stars, and each other. You feel it right away. This was a place of power, spiritual, astronomical, imperial. But just beyond the main plazas and ceremonial baths, hidden in more intimate spaces, the human story peeks through. You find yourself in a small room, one of many built into the hill's slope. Inside is a clay vessel, beautiful glazed in earth tones, with a rounded body and a neck that flares like a trumpet. But when you tilt it just right, the light reveals a scene painted along its surface. Two figures engaged in a very specific act of intimacy with detailed anatomical accuracy and absolutely zero attempt at modesty. You blink, adjust your grip, and yep, there it is, and more. In the foreground of the scene, a third figure is holding what looks suspiciously like a tool, long curved with a bulbous end. This is not abstract. This is not subtle. Congratulations. You've just discovered the world of erotic mocha pottery, and it's about to change how you see pre-Columbian South America forever. Here's your historical fact. The Moche civilization, which thrived along the northern coast of Peru from about 100 to 800 CE, well before the rise of the Inca, produced thousands of ceramic vessels depicting sexual acts in incredibly explicit detail. These weren't just one-offs. They were mass-reduced in workshops, distributed widely, and found in elite graves. Some are humorous, some clinical, some deeply spiritual. Many show the use of tools, both internal and external, handled with skill, intent, and sometimes unmistakable joy. You sit down on a stone ledge, cradling another vessel just uncovered from a dusty alcove. This one shows two women, their hair tied up, one lying back, while the other holds an object that looks exactly like a double-ended dildo, carved from bone or wood. Maybe it's shaped with care, rounded edges, a smooth taper. The depiction is not only frank, it's loving, the kind of scene you'd expect in a modern art exhibit, titled something like The History of Intimacy, except it's over 1,000 years old and made by people who didn't even have a written language as we know it. Here's your fringe fact. Some of these pots show what can only be described as ancient kink, bondage, group sex, and even what appear to be religious rituals involving the insertion of objects as offerings or spiritual acts. And while this might sound shocking, in Mochi cosmology, the body and its fluids were part of the sacred cycle. Fertility wasn't separate from divinity, and neither, it seems, were the tools that facilitated it. Of course, some historians and curators have spent decades trying to sanitize this art. You'll see these vessels labeled as fertility jars, mythological scenes, or the ever-popular, unidentified ritual object. But let's be real. When a pot shows a man using a carved device on himself while seated on a throne made of skulls, we're not talking about just corn worship. As you explore further, you find more of these vessels. Some wrapped in cloth, others stored with personal items and beads, weaving tools, tiny mirrors. It's clear these weren't just ceremonial. They were private, practical, owned. The Inca, who came later, weren't quite as open about it. Their empire was more rigid, their public art less graphic, but behind closed doors, well, let's just say the Spanish conquistadors were scandalized by the freedom with which Andean women discussed sex and bodily pleasure. Some reports describe devotional tools kept by priestesses at some temples, made of gold or polished stone, shaped like animals or gods, but with obvious dual purposes. You step into a small home, half collapsed now, but once part of a family compound. The walls are bare, but a stone shelf remains intact. On it, you find a carved gourd sealed with wax. You break it open carefully, and inside, nestled in woven alpaca wool, are three items: a bone comb, a tiny pouch of cocoa leaves, and a slender phallic shape carved from polished obsidian. Cold, smooth, perfectly balanced. There's no mistaking it. Someone once held this with reverence. You wonder about the woman who owned it. Was she a noble's wife left alone during campaigns? A weaver creating textiles so fine they were used as currency? Or maybe a priestess using pleasure as a bridge to the gods. Whatever the case, she didn't seem ashamed. She wrapped this carefully. She preserved it. She passed it on, or maybe buried it, with the hope that whoever found it next would understand. And here's something scholars still argue about. Were these objects just for fun, for fertility, for power? Were they part of sexual education, a guide for initiates? Were they magical or just practical? The truth probably lies somewhere in the overlap. In a world where life and death were one breath apart, maybe pleasure was a defiance, a prayer, a little rebellion carved in stone. As dusk paints the mountains gold and blood red, you walk out to the edge of a cliff and look down at the valley below. Llamas bleat in the distance. The wind carries the scent of eucalyptus and dust. You slide the obsidian piece back into its gourd, tuck it into the cloth, and return it to the shelf. Not everything needs to be claimed, studied, cataloged. Some things are better left where they belong, in the warmth of a hand, the hush of a room, the memory of a mountain. Now, the heat is different. Drier, sharper, humming beneath your feet, as if the ground itself remembers something. You're in Africa now, though the exact location shifts as you move. One moment among the baobab trees of Mali, the next in the grassy plains of Nigeria, and then in the dense forests of the Congo. This isn't a single civilization, but a mosaic of them. Kingdoms and empires that rose and fell long before Europe noticed they existed. Cultures that didn't need cathedrals or marble columns to understand the power of intimacy. And as you're about to see, they had their own central innovations. Some elegant, some symbolic, some undeniably creative. You're guided by rhythm here. Not footsteps, not maps. Drums pulse faintly in the background, not so much music as heartbeat. You follow it through a cluster of thatched huts, arranged in a spiral carefully, intentionally, until you reach one on the outer ring. The doorway is low, and when you step inside, the air is thick with herbs and wood smoke. A woman sits cross-legged by the fire, grinding seeds in a bowl. Her jewelry jingles softly when she moves. Glass beads, polished bone, and a carved pendant shaped like something that immediately raises your eyebrows. You blink. She catches your glance and smiles. Here's your historical fact. In many African cultures, especially among the Yoruba, Ashanti, and Bantu-speaking peoples, sexuality was not inherently taboo or sinful. In fact, it was frequently woven into ritual art and daily life. Fertility statues, initiation rites, and healing ceremonies often incorporated the use of symbolic and literal sexual objects. Some were wooden carvings resembling male or female anatomy used in instructional ritual. Others were more intimate, carved plugs, beads, and wands used during rites of passage, often by women, often in secret. And here's your fringe fact. Among the Kuyo and several other East African communities, initiation ceremonies for girls sometimes included the gift of personal objects. Small carved tools used to explore the body, passed from elder to initiate with instructions whispered over a gourd of palm wine. These weren't considered shameful. They were tools of empowerment, bodily knowledge, and preparation for adulthood. The modern term sex toy doesn't even begin to capture what these objects meant. You crouch near a woven mat where a cloth bundle rests, wrapped tightly in dyed fabric. Inside, a collection of items, carved ivory, shaped wood, stones smoothed by water, and a few objects so delicately crafted they could pass as art pieces in a gallery. One is shaped like a snake coiled in a circle. Another resembles a crescent moon. The materials vary: ebony, soapstone, even hammered copper. Each is worn from use, not display. You pick up one carved from dark wood, about the length of your forearm, heavy, polished to a mirror shine. Along its sides, patterns have been etched: spirals, eyes, small figures dancing in a ring. It's unmistakably phallic, but also strangely abstract, like it's meant to be more than it appears. And maybe it is. You learn that this particular piece belonged to a midwife used during labor and healing, but also for personal ceremony. It wasn't hidden. It was hung on the wall beside her tools. Outside, under the shade of a large acacia tree, another woman teaches a group of girls. They sit in a circle, giggling, listening, learning. She holds up objects as she speaks, not textbooks but carvings. This is sex education, ancient style, direct, honest, and deeply rooted in cultural respect for the body. No diagrams, no shame, just the tools, the knowledge, and the understanding that pleasure and power often walk hand in hand. Some of the objects are surprisingly complex, like a set of interlocking rings carved from bone, meant to be worn during foreplay to heighten sensation, or possibly as symbolic gestures in ritual dances. Others are more direct, elongated shapes with curved ends meant to stimulate specific areas. Some have small bells attached that chime faintly when moved. One even contains a hollow section filled with dried seeds, rattling like a maraca, sound of sensation. You discover a tale passed from grandmother to granddaughter about a queen who possessed a golden wand carved from a sacred tree struck by lightning. It was said to have healing powers, but also to bring dreams of fire and sweetness. When she died, it was buried with her, wrapped in leopard skin and sealed in a clay jar. Some say it was just a symbol of power. Others say it was her favorite possession, maybe both. Of course, the modern archaeological record often fails to capture this. Many of these objects were carved from organic materials: wood, leather, plant fiber that didn't survive the centuries. And even when they were preserved, their purpose is often mislabeled, described blandly as ritual artifact or unknown use, which is a little ironic considering how clear the shapes often are. It's not that the truth isn't visible, it's that we haven't always been ready to see it. And that brings us to the debate. Some researchers argue that these objects were symbolic only, never actually used. Others, especially those from within the cultures being studied, push back hard. They argue that dismissing these items as just art or purely ceremonial is its own form of cultural blindness. Because in these communities, the line between sacred and sensual, didn't exist the way it does in post-colonial interpretations. An object could be beautiful, spiritual, and intensely pleasurable. You step into another home, this one's smaller, quieter. An elder sits beside a window weaving a new cloth. She doesn't speak, but she gestures to a small woven basket in the corner. Inside are items wrapped in red cloth, oil jars, beads, and one long, thin tool carved from ivory. You recognize the shape. It's not dramatic. It's subtle, elegant, curved like a question mark. She nods slowly like she knows what you're thinking. It belonged to her, passed to her by her aunt, who received it from her mother. 4 generations of pleasure, of healing, of knowing the body, not as a burden, but as a gift. As dusk settles over the village, the drums begin again, soft at first, then rising in rhythm, not for war, not for mourning, but for celebration. A wedding maybe, or a harvest. You can't be sure, but you know this. Somewhere someone will dance with an object beneath their clothing that no one sees. But that holds a story, a ritual, a rite. You leave the village with the echo of drums behind you, the smell of fire and jasmine clinging to your clothes. The path winds out through tall grasses, and somewhere beneath your feet 1,000 carved things lie waiting, still warm from the hands that made them. You blink, and the green disappears. The jungle, the drum, the warm earth under your feet, all gone in a blink. What you feel now is sun, but it's different, brighter, sharper. The light bounces off red earth and sandstone ridges, illuminating a land that feels ancient in its very bones. You've arrived in Australia long before the Europeans, before maps, before even time as we understand it. You're standing in the dreaming, the timeless spiritual layer of Aboriginal Australia, where every stone, every tree of every breath is connected to a story. And yes, those stories, some of them whisper with desire. This isn't a civilization marked by massive structures or buried cities. Aboriginal culture is oral, carved into rock, and passed on through song, dance, and ceremony. It's subtle, layered, and often deliberately cryptic. Outsiders are rarely shown the full picture. But tonight, you're being allowed a glimpse not into mythologies of serpents and sky ancestors, but into a quieter corner of Aboriginal life, the realm of sexuality and the objects used to explore it. You follow a path lined with ghost gums and spin effects until it opens into a rocky overhang sheltering one of the oldest art galleries on Earth. The walls are covered in ochre drawings, figures dancing, hunting, giving birth, merging with animals shifting shape. You kneel by one section that seems different, a line of painted forms, each about the length of your hand with rounded ends and curved sides. They repeat in patterns, not tools, not weapons. These are personal. Here's your historical fact. Among many Aboriginal groups, sexuality was not sinful or hidden. It was ceremonial, initiatory, and deeply respected. Some rituals involve symbolic objects, carved and painted items passed between generations, used in private or during rites of passage. These items were often crafted by women for women or by elders teaching the younger generation how to understand, control, and honor the body's power. While rarely discussed in Western academic circles, anthropologists working in remote communities have recorded descriptions of tools used for self-pleasure, stimulation during childbirth, or fertility rituals. And here's your fringe fact. In some Dreamtime stories, certain creator spirits are explicitly sexual, using phallic objects to shape the landscape, penetrating the earth, carving rivers, creating life. One myth from Arnhem tells of a spirit woman who carries a curved digging stick that also serves as a pleasure object, both tool and talisman, used to awaken the body and the land at once. The stick is carved with notches representing her lovers, human, spirit, and animal. It's hidden in a cave said to be too sacred for outsiders to enter. Naturally, no one's ever confirmed whether the stick still exists, but the story persists. You're led now by an elder, a woman with silver hair and eyes that don't miss a thing. She doesn't speak much, just nods and walks, taking you to a fire circle nestled between ancient boulders. She sits, unwraps a small cloth, and lays out three objects on the ground. One is shaped like a boomerang, smooth and polished. Another resembles a small serpent coiled tight with a flattened end. The third is almost abstract, like a river path bent at an angle, carved from ironwood and dark with age. She gestures for you to look but not touch. These aren't toys in the modern sense. They're ceremonial items, each linked to a particular dreaming line. To the initiated, they hold layers of meaning, some personal, some cosmological. You realize then that in this culture, the physical and the spiritual are never separate. A pleasure object is also a memory stick, a map, a rite of passage, a form of medicine. It's all of those things, or none of them, depending on who you are and what you've earned the right to know. You glance up at a rock face nearby, where a petroglyph has been chiseled into the stone. It shows a female figure with exaggerated curves, surrounded by concentric circles and lines that ripple outward like vibrations. She holds a long forked stick. Some say it's for digging yams. Others say it's symbolic of her sexual power. Maybe both, maybe neither. As with most things here, interpretation is earned, not assumed. You sit by the fire, and the elder tells a short story, simple, almost childlike into rhythm. It's about a girl who wandered into a river and found a piece of driftwood shaped like the crescent moon. The wood whispered to her when she touched it. It told her stories. It made her body sing. She took it home and kept it hidden, not out of shame, but because it would become her private story, her own dreaming. The tale ends without a moral, just a quiet sense of mystery. You realize that's the point. And here's where the skull debate kicks in. Many Western archaeologists have long ignored or downplayed the existence of Aboriginal sex toys. They argue there's no direct evidence, no written records, no explicit labels. But Indigenous knowledge keepers argue that evidence has been there all along, carved into song lines encoded in ceremonies, passed down in whispered instruction. You just have to know how to listen, and more importantly, when to stop asking. In some communities, young women are still taught using symbolic objects, sometimes wooden, sometimes made of kangaroo bone, or even a kitten quills tied together with string. These aren't mass-produced or openly displayed. They're made with intention, blessed with smoke and song, and used in private ceremonies no camera has ever captured. The objects themselves aren't sacred, the knowledge around them is. You're invited to hold one now, the smallest of the three. It's cool to the touch, carved from desert oak, its surface etched with cross-hatching like a fingerprint. It's heavier than it looks. You can almost feel its history pulsing through the grain. You place it back down carefully, and the elder gives you a small nod, the kind that means you've done something right without ever really knowing what it was. As the sun sets behind the red cliffs, the world turns gold, then indigo. The fire crackles low. A song rises in the dark. No words, just tone, vibration, the kind of sound that wraps around you like a blanket. You realize this place holds pleasures that aren't just about sensation. They're about story, identity, connection, the body, yes, but also everything beyond it. You leave the fire circle in the elder already fading back into the dreaming. Somewhere behind you, those carved tools lie nestled in cloth, waiting for the next hand, the next story, the next whisper. And you walk away barefoot, quieter, carrying a truth no one will ever write down. Not because it's forbidden, because it doesn't need to be said. It's already known. You awaken now to a sound you've heard all your life. Church bells. Except this time, they toll over sun-baked hills and stone walls stained with time. The terrain is familiar but tense, like it's holding back 1,000 whispered stories. You're in the Levant, biblical territory, somewhere near ancient Jerusalem or Jericho, or maybe the ruins of a city whose name didn't survive translation. It smells like dust, olive oil, and stone. And there's an almost physical weight in the air, like every breeze has to carry 2,000 years of theology with it. You're probably expecting temples and scrolls, prophets and commandments, but you're not here for that. Not tonight. Tonight, you're slipping into the edges of a world too often presented as black and white, moral and immoral, sacred and profane. But if history has taught us anything, it's that humans have never been tidy. Even in the land of Scripture, someone was sneaking a little something under their robe. You find yourself wandering through a half-buried house made of sun-dried mud brick. The roof's long gone, but the floor plan is clear. One large room for living and a smaller one tucked behind a stone partition, private, shaded, and still intact enough to feel intimate. You kneel beside a clay jar toppled near the corner. It's cracked but not empty. Inside is a tightly bound cloth, and within that a small object of carved bone shaped unmistakably for pleasure. Here's your historical fact. In the ancient Near East, including Canaanite, Israelite, and early Judeo-Christian cultures, sexual was not universally taboo. In fact, early fertility cults like those honoring Asher or Ishtar celebrated sexuality openly. Temples had sacred prostitutes, rituals invoked pleasure as divine, and erotic artifacts, including figurines and tools, have been found in surprising numbers. Many of them predate the monotheistic term that would later redefine sex as something mostly controlled, limited, and policed. The object in your hand is no exception. It's small, hand-carved, the end polished smooth from years, maybe generations of use. It fits the curve of your palm, not flashy or ornate, just honest, functional. You can see where the grain of the bone spirals slightly, and at one end, a faded engraving, a tree maybe, or a river. The symbol is open to interpretation, much like everything else around here. And here's your fringe fact. There are apocryphal texts, those books that didn't make it into the final cut of the Bible, that refer to the instruments of Eve and Sarah's stones of fire. Scholars argue endlessly about what these lines meant. Some insist they're metaphors. Others suggest they're references to personal ritual items, possibly used for fertility, pleasure, or both. One medieval commentary claims, the wives of Lot brought idols shaped for secret knowing. You do with that what you will. But of course, once monotheism took firm root, things began to shift. The ancient goddesses were cast aside, the temples were razed, the pleasure-positive rituals were reframed as sins or heresies. But culture doesn't erase itself that easily. People adapt, they repurpose. They tuck things into clay jars and hide them in floorboards. They teach their daughters in whispers. They continue. You move through another house, this one partially excavated, and find a low stone shelf near what would have been a sleeping mat. On it rests a pair of small carved idols. One male, one female, both of them erotic in pose and proportion. Between them is a small clay object shaped like a bulb with a flared base. It's too smooth, too deliberate to be anything but what you think it is. And yes, scholars still argue about these artifacts. Some call them fertility charms. Others label them as ritual cleansing objects, and some just avoid assigning purpose altogether, afraid of tarnishing the religious backdrop with something as human as desire. But that's the problem, isn't it? We pretend ancient faith was incompatible with pleasure, when in reality they were once deeply entangled. You step into the ruins of what was once a bathhouse, communal, open perfumed with oils and chatter. In these places, people weren't just washing away dirt. They were relaxing, flirting, indulging. Clay tablets from Ugarit Akkad and early Hebrew texts suggest that scented oils were sometimes used with small handheld tools designed to heighten sensation, rounded rods, ridged discs, and in one notable case, a hollow cylinder meant to be filled with honey. Sure, the official translation calls it a jar for ceremonial offerings, but come on. You find another object now, half buried near a cracked system. It's a small ring made of copper, slightly warped, but with notches on one side and a curved edge on the other. Possibly a grip, possibly a stop. Your brain doesn't need much help filling in the blanks. It's not ornate. It wasn't made for show. This was for someone's hand, someone's use, someone who lived a full life, prayed, sinned, loved, and when the moment called for it, took care of their own needs with something small and secret. The more you think about it, the more obvious it becomes. This land, so deeply saturated with moral narratives, also had a hidden network of pleasure. Not organized, not institutionalized, but personal, intimate objects carved in quiet, used in solitude, passed without fanfare. Love letters that weren't written in ink but in wear patterns. Tools of survival in a world that often asked women to bear everything and express nothing. One last home reveals your favorite find of the night. A wooden box warped with age containing 3 items. An oil vial, a feather for application, and a long, gently curved stone shaped like a question. Not just a metaphorical question either. It literally curves like one. Your hand fits it perfectly. And suddenly you understand how universal this is. Across cultures, continents, languages, people keep coming back to the same forms, the same shapes, the same timeless needs. As night falls across the hills, the stars emerge slowly, almost shy. The land is quiet, but you feel a hum under the silence, a kind of invisible archive pulsing beneath the soil. For all the stories written in sacred texts, there are others not written at all. They're carved in clay, wrapped in linen, buried beside women whose names were never recorded, but whose lives were full and complex and sensual. You leave the site with dust on your hands and something heavier in your chest. Not guilt, not scandal, just a renewed sense of awe for how deeply human history really is. Even in the holiest places, says someone once reached for pleasure and found a way to hold it. The walls here are stone thick and damp with the memory of secrets. You're deep in medieval Europe now, somewhere between the 11th and 14th centuries, the age of cathedrals, crusades, and chastity belts. The world around you is cold, both physically and ideologically. Firewood is scarce, privacy is scarcer. And yet, even here, behind monastery walls and under heavy woolen cloaks, people found ways to explore pleasure. They always do. You're standing in a stone-walled chamber, probably a storeroom or cellar beneath a noble estate. It smells of root vegetables, dust, and something else. Beeswax, maybe. On a crooked wooden shelf lies a box, iron-bound, locked once but now rusted open. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen, you find something smooth and unexpected. A cylindrical object carved from ivory, cool to the touch, and far too anatomically detailed to be mistaken for anything but what it is. So much for medieval piety. Here's your historical fact. Despite what pop culture would have you believe, the Middle Ages weren't entirely prudish. Medieval medical texts, especially those translated from earlier Islamic or Greco-Roman sources, contain candid discussions about sexuality, female desire, and even the occasional advice on how to quell longing in the absence of a partner. Some of these texts describe devices used to stimulate the genitals, usually unveiled, almost comically indirect language, instruments of gentle massage, remedies for the humors, or the ever-popular tools to prevent hysteria. And here's your fringe of fact. In the 12th century, a medical guide known as the Trula, written by a female physician or perhaps a collection of women, includes descriptions of treating female sexual frustration with warm compresses, oils, and most interestingly, a shaped implement of horn or wood used in privacy to restore balance. Historians have long danced around that passage, labeling it therapeutic. But let's be honest, it reads a lot like the medieval version of a trusted nightstand drawer. You move upstairs into the main house. The great hall is empty, but there are signs of life. Stale bread on a table, a goblet tipped on its side, a fire still smoldering in the hearth. Beyond a heavy oak door lies the master bedroom, draped in heavy velvet. Near the bed is a chest with personal effects, letters, a silver brush, dried lavender, and beneath it all a polished object shaped from dark wood, curved at one end with a handle carved into a pair of interlocking vines. It's not mass-reduced. It was handmade, maybe by a skilled craftsman, maybe by a lover. This was someone's prized possession, and they weren't alone. In parts of Europe, particularly Italy and France, there's evidence of marriage aids given to newlyweds, small devices usually crafted from ivory, designed to train a bride in physical matters. Some were kept in decorative cases and passed down awkwardly from mother to daughter. Others were destroyed or hidden by church officials who found them too suggestive. You find a manuscript tucked under a loose stone, half faded, its Latin inked in delicate script. It's a confessor's manual, a guide for priests hearing the sins of the flock. One section offers detailed instruction for dealing with women who abuse wooden idols of their own making. The language is dramatic, of course. Beware the sin of wood and loneliness. But between the fire and brimstone, there's an unexpected acknowledgement. These objects existed frequently enough to be mentioned, persistently enough to be punished. And yet, even within the cloistered life of monasteries, pleasure wasn't entirely absent. In fact, some of the most explicit medieval art can be found in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Tiny monks with enormous phalluses, nuns riding wildly inappropriate beasts. One manuscript famously includes an image of a woman harvesting what appears to be a tree full of disembodied penises. No one really knows what to make of it, but it's there, inked in gold leaf, preserved in libraries, silently shouting that desire never really went anywhere. And here's something to consider. The idea of the chastity belt, the iron contraption supposedly used to lock women away from temptation, may have been more myth than reality. Most historians now believe they were either symbolic or satirical, not practical. In other words, people joked about locking up desire, but they weren't actually doing it. And meanwhile, in private, they were carving tools of release. You move now through a narrow corridor and into a chamber that's clearly feminine. A spinning wheel in the corner, embroidery half finished on the table, a candle burned low beside a mirror. In a velvet pouch beneath the bed linens, you find another item, smooth stone shaped like a teardrop, cool and weighty. There's a faint floral carving at the base, and the whole thing smells faintly of rose oil. It was used, yes, but also treasured. Some believe women of the time used these tools as much for control as pleasure. In a world where bodies were often regulated by men, fathers, priests, husbands, having something of your own, hidden and powerful, was an act of quiet rebellion. Not loud, not scandalous, just yours. Of course, the church was never far behind. Penitentials, handbooks listing sins and their punishments, often included stern warnings about self-touching and unholy devices. But the more they warned, the more they seemed to confirm that such practices were widespread. You don't threaten people with fire and damnation unless they're doing something often enough to worry you. As you step outside the manor, the night air bites at your skin. The stars wheel above, the same ones the nuns and knights and lovers all once stared at, wondering if what they felt was wrong or just human. Somewhere across the fields, bells toll again. Vespers, maybe? Or just another reminder that someone somewhere was always watching. But not here.